Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into the opulent, often perilous, world of ancient Chinese courts, specifically to unravel the story of Dong Xian, a man whose name is synonymous with imperial favoritism and, arguably, love. Imagine the silk rustling, the faint scent of plum blossoms, and the chilling silence of a Han Dynasty palace. You're there, a whisper away from an emperor whose heart holds the ultimate power and whose deepest affection could raise a humble man higher than any noble or send him crashing down. This isn't just history, it's a journey into the heart of power, where a whisper could elevate you to unimaginable heights or send you plummeting to oblivion. And trust me, you probably won't survive this ride if you were actually there. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story, or rather, your story tonight, begins with Emperor Ai of Han, a young ruler who ascended the dragon throne in 7 BC. He was, by all accounts, a rather delicate soul, somewhat adrift in the vast ocean of courtly expectations. You can almost picture him, pale and pensive, burdened by the weight of an empire, seeking solace amidst the endless ceremonies and political machinations. It's into this environment that Dong Xian steps, seemingly by chance, though in history, chance often has a funny way of being meticulously orchestrated. Dong Xian was a minor official, perhaps a privy secretary or a court attendant, one of countless young men moving through the palace corridors, indistinguishable from the others to the casual observer. He wasn't of noble birth in the grandest sense, certainly not from one of the powerful consort families who typically held sway. His background was relatively humble, yet he possessed something that for Emperor Ai proved utterly irresistible. Imagine you're there, witnessing the emperor's initial encounter with Dong Xian. Perhaps it's a formal ceremony or a quiet moment in a garden, the scent of plum blossoms heavy in the air. Dong Xian is young, handsome, with a gentle demeanor that historians still argue whether it was genuine naivete or a shrewd understanding of human nature, particularly that of a lonely emperor. He was, by all accounts, exceptionally beautiful, described in records as having a catamite's comeliness, a classical way of saying he was utterly captivating. It wasn't just his looks, though, that hooked the emperor. It was, seemingly, his charm, his attentiveness, and perhaps the genuine affection he began to show for the emperor. In a world of sycophants and power-hungry relatives, a straightforward, seemingly uncalculating devotion must have felt like a cool drink of water in a desert. You can practically feel the shift in the emperor's gaze, the subtle turning of his head whenever Dong Xian was near. It was like watching a slow-motion movie of destiny unfolding. The speed of Dong Xian's ascent was frankly breathtaking. It was less of a climb and more of an instantaneous teleportation to the pinnacle of imperial favor. Within a very short span, perhaps just a few months, he went from an obscure functionary to the emperor's constant companion, sharing the imperial bed, the imperial meals, and increasingly the imperial confidence. This kind of meteoric rise was, even by the standards of a court known for its dramatic shifts in fortune, astonishing. It's like going from being a nameless intern to the CEO's inseparable best friend practically overnight. You can almost hear the gasps and murmurs among the other courtiers, the sharp intake of breath as they realized the extent of this new bond. It was an unprecedented display of imperial favoritism, one that would send shockwaves throughout the entire empire. This rapid elevation wasn't just about personal affection, it immediately translated into immense political power, as you're about to see. This wasn't just a casual friendship, you see. It was an entanglement that bordered on the obsessive, at least from Emperor Ai's side. Imagine yourself as a fly on the gilded wall, watching the two of them. The emperor, who had previously been somewhat reserved, now seemed to shed his imperial stiffness whenever Dong Xian was near. He showered Dong Xian with gifts that would make a modern-day influencer blush with envy. Vast sums of money, priceless silks, jewels that shimmered like captured starlight, and estates so sprawling they could comfortably house a small village. It was a lavish display, so over the top that it signaled to everyone in the court, from the lowliest eunuch to the most powerful minister, that Dong Xian was not merely a favorite, but the favorite. The depth of this bond became legendary, primarily because the emperor made no secret of it. You'd hear tales whispered through the palace of how Emperor Ai couldn't bear to be separated from Dong Xian for even a moment. They ate together, slept together, and even conducted official business with Dong Xian by the emperor's side. It was an intimacy that transcended the typical boundaries of an imperial relationship, blurring the lines between ruler and confidant, and perhaps something more profound. Historians still argue whether this was a true romantic love in the modern sense, or a deeply possessive affection born of loneliness and the unique power dynamics of the imperial court. But whatever its nature, its intensity was undeniable. Consider the famous anecdote that perfectly encapsulates this bond, a story that became the very symbol of their relationship and even gave rise to a Chinese idiom, the passion of the cut sleeve. You're there, perhaps a junior attendant, peeking around the column. Emperor Ai awakens from a nap, ready for an important audience. As he stirs, he finds Dong Xian asleep, his head resting gently on the emperor's sleeve. Instead of disturbing Dong Xian, instead of calling a servant to wake him, the emperor, with a tenderness that must have shocked anyone witnessing it, takes a knife and carefully cuts off the part of his robe on which Dong Xian was sleeping. He would rather slice his expensive imperial garment than disrupt his beloved slumber. It's a moment that, centuries later, still speaks volumes about the depth of his devotion. This wasn't just a quirky tidbit. It was a public declaration, a clear message to the court that Dong Xian's comfort, his peace, was paramount, even over the emperor's own convenience or the sanctity of his imperial robes. This kind of blatant favoritism, of course, did not go unnoticed, nor was it universally welcomed. You can almost feel the simmering resentment beneath the surface of courtly politeness. The established families, the powerful ministers who had clawed their way to influence over generations, watched with growing alarm as this young man, seemingly out of nowhere, usurped their positions. Imagine the whispered conversations behind cupped hands, the subtle eye rolls when Dong Xian's name was mentioned. The palace was a viper's nest of ambition, and Dong Xian had just waltzed into the most coveted spot without playing by any of the traditional rules. This immediate, profound connection to the emperor bypassed all the usual channels of power and influence, making him a lightning rod for jealousy and suspicion. It was a dangerous game he was inadvertently playing, even if he didn't fully comprehend the stakes. As Dong Xian's star ascended, the very atmosphere of the court thickened with jealousy and resentment. You could practically cut the tension with a jade ceremonial dagger. The old guard, those venerable ministers who had served for decades, their families having held power for generations, watched with barely concealed fury. They had painstakingly climbed the intricate ladder of bureaucracy, mastered the arcane rituals of court, and forged alliances through strategic marriages and political maneuvering. And then there was Dong Xian, a mere youth, bypassing all of it on the strength of the emperor's overwhelming affection. It was like watching someone win the lottery by simply existing, while you'd spent your life buying tickets and studying probability. The whispers began subtly, then grew louder. "He's too young," some would murmur, echoing through the sprawling palace complexes. "He lacks experience." Others, bolder, would hint at more sinister implications. "He's unduly influencing the Son of Heaven." Remember, in ancient China, the emperor was considered the link between heaven and earth. Any perceived weakness or improper influence on him was a threat to the cosmic order itself. This wasn't just about losing face, it was about the stability of the empire. You might overhear a wizened court astrologer muttering about unfavorable omens, or a Confucian scholar decrying the abandonment of traditional rites in favor of frivolous entertainment with the new favorite. One of the key figures in this rising tide of opposition was the Dowager Empress Fu, Emperor Ai's own grandmother. She was a formidable woman, a true power player in her own right, accustomed to wielding significant influence behind the scenes. Her ambition was as sharp as any blade in the imperial armory. She viewed Dong Xian not just as an interloper, but as a direct threat to her family's power base, particularly her own. She had carefully groomed Emperor Ai, believing he would be her puppet, and now this handsome young man was monopolizing his attention and loyalty. You can imagine her rage, barely contained beneath her silken robes, as she watched her carefully constructed web of influence unravel. Historians still argue whether her opposition was purely self-serving, aimed at maintaining her family's grip on power, or if she genuinely believed Dong Xian was a destabilizing force for the dynasty. Perhaps it was a potent mix of both. The Dowager Empress Fu and other powerful factions weren't content to merely whisper. They began to actively undermine Dong Xian, albeit cautiously at first. They'd subtly question his appointments, challenge his proposals in court, or simply refuse to cooperate with his directives. It was a slow, deliberate poisoning of the well, designed to erode his credibility and chip away at the emperor's trust. You could feel the subtle pressure, the way an entire court could turn its collective back like a slow-motion wave of disapproval washing over him. Every lavish gift from the emperor, every new promotion for Dong Xian's relatives only fueled the fire of resentment, making him a bigger target. It was a dangerous game of chess, and Dong Xian, despite his proximity to the ultimate power, was still just a pawn in the eyes of many. The court's simmering resentment wasn't just about Dong Xian's rapid ascent. It was amplified by Emperor Ai's increasingly radical ideas about his favorite's future. You're now deep inside the Forbidden City, where whispers turn into hushed gasps of disbelief. Emperor Ai, seemingly blinded by his devotion, began to entertain a notion so audacious, so utterly unprecedented, it sent shivers down the spines of even the most seasoned courtiers. He wanted to make Dong Xian his successor. Imagine the sheer audacity of this proposition in a dynastic system built on strict lineage and hereditary rule. The Han Dynasty had endured for centuries precisely because of a clear, albeit sometimes bloody, succession plan. To suggest that a non-royal, a mere courtier, could inherit the imperial throne was akin to proposing that the sun would rise from the west. It was an affront to tradition, to the ancestors, and to every powerful clan that had a vested interest in the imperial bloodline. You might overhear an old minister clutching his chest, feigning a sudden illness at the very thought, or a general muttering darkly about the potential for civil war. One particularly notorious incident that highlighted this dangerous ambition involved Emperor Ai attempting to create a new, supremely elevated title for Dong Xian. Not content with Dong Xian being merely a marquis or a grand marshal, the emperor proposed making him the Duke of Gaoan, with an unprecedented grant of territory and authority. This wasn't just a fancy name, it was a move designed to place Dong Xian on a near-royal footing, effectively setting him up as a regent or a powerful king in his own right, should anything happen to the emperor. The implications were staggering. It was a direct challenge to the established order, a slap in the face to the imperial clan and the Empress Dowager Wang, who, as you might recall, was becoming increasingly alarmed by the situation. Historians still argue whether Emperor Ai genuinely believed this was feasible, or if it was a desperate, almost childlike attempt to secure his beloved's future, heedless of the catastrophic consequences.
The resistance to this particular move was fierce and immediate. You could feel the collective pushback from the court, a rare moment of unified opposition. Grand Minister Wang Jia, a stern and upright official, dared to openly defy the emperor, arguing vehemently against the proposal. He pointed out the danger, the violation of ancestral laws, and the potential for chaos. This act of defiance, remember, was incredibly risky. Disobeying an emperor, especially one as infatuated as I, could mean exile, torture, or even execution. Yet the stakes were so high that Wang Jia felt compelled to speak truth to power. While Wang Jia's opposition initially succeeded in shelving the Duke of Gaoan plan, it also earns him the emperor's deep displeasure, a precursor to the dangers that lay ahead for anyone who dared to stand in Dong Xian's way. The emperor, though thwarted, did not abandon his ultimate dream for Dong Xian. He merely bided his time, searching for other avenues to elevate his favorite.
Emperor Ai's relentless efforts to elevate Dong Xian weren't just about titles and personal proximity. They quickly translated into a remarkable, almost unbelievable ascendancy for Dong Xian's entire family. Imagine, if you will, a powerful wave, and Dong Xian is at its crest, carrying his relatives effortlessly along with him. You're watching this unfold, perhaps as a minor official, noting how suddenly every Dong was a somebody. It was nepotism on an imperial scale, unprecedented in its scope and speed. Dong Xian's father, Dong Gong, who was originally a mere commoner, was elevated to the prestigious position of Minister of Palace Affairs, a role of immense power and influence. His younger brother, Dong Quan, was appointed commandant of the Imperial Guard, placing him in charge of the emperor's personal security and control over a significant portion of the palace military. This wasn't just a ceremonial post, it meant that Dong Xian's family now had direct command over the very forces that protected the emperor and maintained order within the Forbidden City. You can almost feel the unease rippling through the established military families, seeing their traditional prerogatives eroded by this meteoric rise. It's like suddenly finding your incompetent cousin in charge of national security. But it didn't stop there. Dong Xian's mother, his wife, and even his distant relatives were all showered with honors, titles, and wealth. His wife's family also benefited, receiving high-ranking appointments and lavish gifts. It was a rapid-fire expansion of power, creating an entirely new, incredibly privileged clique at the very heart of the imperial court. You might see Dong Xian's mother, once a humble woman, now adorned in the finest silks, her carriages vying for space with those of ancient noble houses. The Dongs, who just a few years prior were virtually unknown, were now a formidable force, their influence radiating outwards from the emperor's private chambers. This sudden concentration of power within the Dong family caused immense friction. The Empress Dowager Wang, who had watched her own family's influence slowly diminish under Emperor Ai's reign, was particularly incensed. She saw the Dongs as usurpers, a threat to the stability of the entire dynasty. This situation became a mainstream historical fact that is often cited as a prime example of the dangers of unchecked imperial favoritism. It wasn't just about the emperor's personal preferences, it was about the very structure of governance being undermined by a single, all-consuming attachment. One particularly quirky or fringe tidbit from this period revolves around the sheer number of minor officials and retainers who flocked to the Dong family, hoping to catch a piece of their reflected glory. Imagine the lines of hopefuls outside the Dong family residences, presenting gifts, offering their services, eager to become part of this new power block. It was a scramble for influence, a feeding frenzy where ambition overshadowed propriety. Historians still argue whether this widespread patronage by the Dongs was a deliberate strategy to build a loyal base or simply an inevitable consequence of their rapid rise and the desperate opportunism of court life. Either way, the Dongs were now firmly entrenched, a new constellation of power in the imperial firmament, their light shining brightly but also casting long, ominous shadows.
With every passing day, the cascade of wealth and lavish gifts bestowed upon Dong Xian reached truly mind-boggling proportions. You're observing this spectacle, perhaps as a junior treasury official, your abacus clattering uselessly as the numbers soar beyond all reason. Emperor Ai seemed determined to outdo himself, showering Dong Xian with riches that would make even the wealthiest Han nobles gape in astonishment. It wasn't just about showing affection, it was about demonstrating his absolute power to elevate anyone he chose, to defy all conventional limits. Imagine piles of gold, not just a few ingots, but vaults overflowing with the precious metal, delivered regularly to Dong Xian's private residence. Silks so fine they felt like spun air, in every color imaginable, enough to clothe an army. Priceless jade artifacts, rare pearls, exotic spices, and timbers from distant lands that could build palaces. Dong Xian, originally of modest means, now possessed more personal wealth than many provincial governors. It was a visible, tangible manifestation of the emperor's favor, designed to impress and perhaps to intimidate. You might even chuckle at the thought of Dong Xian needing an army of servants just to count and categorize all his new acquisitions, perhaps debating whether to get a bigger vault or just start building walls out of gold ingots. Beyond the movable wealth, the emperor granted Dong Xian vast tracts of prime land, including fertile agricultural estates that brought in immense annual revenues. These weren't just token parcels, they were significant holdings, some even near the imperial capital, traditionally reserved for imperial family members or the most powerful clans. This transfer of land represented a direct shift of economic power, a mainstream historical fact that highlights the destabilizing effect of imperial infatuation. It was akin to giving away national parks to your best friend today. One particularly striking and frankly quirky tidbit involved the emperor commissioning bespoke carriages for Dong Xian, far more luxurious and elaborate than those of other high-ranking officials. These were not mere conveyances, they were moving palaces, adorned with gold, precious stones, and rare timbers. You could spot Dong Xian's entourage from a mile away, glittering like a mobile treasure trove, a public display of his unique status that few dared to emulate. Historians still argue whether the sheer excess was a conscious strategy by Emperor Ai to further isolate Dong Xian, making him entirely dependent on the emperor's protection, or simply the unchecked indulgence of a young man with absolute power. The generosity extended beyond Dong Xian himself to his immediate family. His parents, as you might recall, were also showered with gifts and luxurious properties. His father, Dong Gong, for example, received an annual stipend that rivaled the income of a grand minister on top of his official salary. This largesse meant that the Dong family as a whole became incredibly wealthy, cementing their new position in the Han elite. It was a stark reminder to the old aristocratic families that their inherited wealth and status could, in an instant, be overshadowed by the emperor's whim. The message was clear. Proximity to the emperor, in this particular reign, was the fastest path to untold riches, regardless of traditional merit or lineage.
Now, let's revisit that iconic moment. The one that truly solidified Dong Xian's legendary status and gave us a timeless idiom, the cut sleeve incident. You're no longer just an observer, you're almost a fly on the bed curtain, right there in the emperor's private chambers, witnessing an intimate tableau that would echo through history. It's mid-morning, the soft light of dawn barely piercing through the elaborate lattice windows of the palace. Emperor Ai, after a night of shared sleep, begins to stir. He awakens, ready to face the pressing matters of state, perhaps an early morning audience with his ministers, or a pile of scrolls demanding his attention. As he shifts, he realizes something. Dong Xian is asleep beside him, his head resting peacefully on the long flowing sleeve of the emperor's luxurious outer robe. This wasn't just any sleeve, it was likely part of his formal court attire, perhaps even a robe he was meant to wear that very morning. It would have been made of the finest silk, probably embroidered with imperial symbols, a garment of significant value and ceremonial importance.
The easy, practical solution would be to simply nudge Dong Xian awake, or perhaps to gently pull his sleeve free. But Emperor Ai does neither. Instead, with a tenderness that speaks volumes of his deep affection, he reaches for a knife, likely a small, elegant personal dagger used for cutting scrolls or fruits, and carefully, precisely slices off the portion of the sleeve on which Dong Xian's head rests. You can almost hear the soft snip of the silk, the delicate fabric parting, leaving Dong Xian undisturbed in his slumber. It's a moment of unparalleled devotion, prioritizing his beloved's comfort over imperial convenience, protocol, or even the integrity of his clothing. This incident immediately entered the annals of Chinese history as a powerful symbol of their extraordinary bond. It's not just a quirky tidbit, it became a mainstream historical fact, immortalized in the idiom duan xiu, or cut sleeve, which, for centuries afterward, was a euphemism for male homosexuality or intense male friendship. You might hear someone today refer to a very close male bond as a cut sleeve relationship, directly referencing this moment from over 2 millennia ago. It's a testament to the enduring power of their story. Historians still argue whether this act was a spontaneous display of genuine love, a calculated public relations move by the emperor to further elevate his favorite, or perhaps a bit of both. Did Emperor Ai simply act on instinct, or did he know that such a gesture would send an unmistakable message to his court about Dong Xian's unassailable position? Regardless, the effect was profound. It signaled to everyone that Dong Xian was not merely a concubine, nor even just a favored minister, but someone held in a unique, almost sacred regard by the Son of Heaven himself. This intimacy, publicly acknowledged and celebrated by the emperor, underscored Dong Xian's unparalleled influence and further inflamed the resentment of those who felt marginalized by their bond.
As Dong Xian's influence blossomed, fed by the emperor's boundless affection, the political atmosphere outside the immediate imperial bubble began to sour. You're no longer just within the palace walls, you're out in the bustling streets of Chang'an, or perhaps in a quiet scholar's courtyard where the mood is shifting. The court's internal strife, born of jealousy and power struggles, began to manifest as widespread disquiet among the populace, fueled by whispers of bad omens and perceived cosmic disapproval. In ancient China, the emperor's conduct and the stability of the realm were believed to be intrinsically linked to the harmony of the cosmos. Natural disasters, floods, droughts, earthquakes, comets were often interpreted as heaven's displeasure with the ruler. And conveniently, during Emperor Ai's reign, with Dong Xian at his side, there were indeed several such occurrences. You might hear a farmer grumbling about an unexpected drought, attributing it to the emperor's unnatural affections, or a street vendor nervously pointing to a comet streaking across the night sky, whispering about a disrupted cosmic balance. These weren't mere superstitions, they were powerful tools of political commentary, often employed by disgruntled officials or rival factions to subtly undermine the emperor's legitimacy and, by extension, Dong Xian's position. One mainstream historical fact is that during this period, there was a noticeable increase in reports of unusual phenomena and dire prophecies circulating throughout the empire. Scholars and astrologers, ever keen to interpret heaven's will, began to openly express concerns. While some of these might have been genuine observations, many were undoubtedly manufactured or exaggerated to serve political agendas. It was a classic case of selective interpretation, where every locust plague or unusual celestial alignment was immediately seized upon as evidence that Emperor Ai was straying from the mandate of heaven, primarily due to his favoritism towards Dong Xian. You can almost hear the sigh of relief from an old minister as he hears about a hailstorm. Aha, proof the heavens disapprove of them. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit from this time involved an incident where a sacred tree in the imperial garden was struck by lightning, an event immediately interpreted by some as a direct sign of divine wrath specifically aimed at the emperor's improper conduct. Imagine the gossip spreading like wildfire, fueled by anonymous pamphlets distributed in the marketplace, condemning the emperor's indulgence and the rise of base characters. These weren't direct attacks on Dong Xian by name, but the implication was clear. Historians still argue whether these omens were truly believed by the populace to be linked to Dong Xian, or if they were skillfully exploited by powerful figures like the Wang clan, who saw an opportunity to sow discord and prepare the ground for their own resurgence. The cumulative effect of these whispered criticisms, public concerns, and perceived omens was a growing sense of unease. The people, from the highest noble to the lowest peasants, began to associate Dong Xian with imperial decadence and a dangerous deviation from traditional norms. This widespread discontent, while not overtly rebellious, created a fragile environment. It meant that Dong Xian's power, despite the emperor's unwavering support, rested on increasingly shaky ground, vulnerable to any shift in the political winds or any sudden downturn in the emperor's fortunes. As Emperor Ai's obsession with Dong Xian intensified, so did his desire to secure Dong Xian's comfort and status even beyond the grave. You're now transported to a more solemn, even macabre scene, the construction of an elaborate tomb, a project usually reserved for emperors and the most revered imperial family members. But this wasn't for an emperor. It was for Dong Xian, and the scale of it was utterly scandalous. Imagine a vast construction site near the imperial mausoleums, bustling with thousands of laborers, the air thick with dust and the clang of hammers. Emperor Ai commanded the construction of a magnificent tomb for Dong Xian, designed to rival his own future burial place. This wasn't just a simple grave, it was a sprawling underground palace, complete with multiple chambers, antechambers, and perhaps even provisions for a grand retinue in the afterlife. The materials used were of the highest quality, precious woods, durable stones, and elaborate carvings, all paid for with the imperial treasury. It was a clear, undeniable mainstream historical fact that this was an unprecedented display of favoritism, blurring the lines between a mere favored subject and a member of the imperial dynasty. You can almost hear the grumbling of the common people, who would have been taxed to fund such extravagance, while they struggle to put food on their own tables. "He gets a palace in the ground while we live in mud huts," they might sigh. The location of this tomb was particularly provocative. Emperor Ai had it built right next to his own planned mausoleum, within the imperial burial grounds reserved solely for the Han emperors and empresses. This move was a deliberate, audacious statement, signaling his intention to grant Dong Xian a status in death that was virtually equal to his own. It was an almost childish insistence on eternal companionship, defying centuries of tradition and proper protocol. You might observe a court architect, looking pale and nervous, trying to explain to the emperor why this was a profoundly bad idea, only to be dismissed with a wave of the imperial hand. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this period describes the sheer speed with which this massive project was undertaken. Emperor Ai poured immense resources into it, demanding that it be completed with an urgency usually reserved for matters of state defense. It was almost as if he feared his own mortality and wanted to ensure Dong Xian's eternal comfort and status while he still could. This frantic pace further exacerbated the drain on the imperial treasury and fueled the public's perception of imperial profligacy. Historians still argue whether Emperor Ai genuinely believed in the spiritual significance of burying Dong Xian alongside him, or if this extravagant tomb was simply the ultimate material expression of his intense possessive devotion. This grand tomb project became yet another point of contention and a symbol of Dong Xian's perceived overreach. It wasn't just an internal court matter, it was a visible, undeniable drain on the empire's resources, openly flouting tradition. It painted Dong Xian as a man whose ambition, or at least the emperor's love for him, knew no bounds, further alienating the powerful clans and cementing the widespread belief that Emperor Ai had lost his grip on reality, all for the sake of his favorite. The blatant favoritism and the extravagant projects surrounding Dong Xian did not, as you might expect, go unchallenged indefinitely.
You're now witnessing the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, pushback from the established powers within the Han court, a delicate dance of political maneuvers and veiled resistance. These weren't outright rebellions, but rather a slow, deliberate tightening of the net around Emperor Ai and his beloved favorite. The most significant and consistent source of opposition came from the Wang clan, particularly the formidable Empress Dowager Wang Zhengjun, who, though not Emperor Ai's direct grandmother, was the matriarch of the powerful Wang family and the Empress Dowager of the preceding emperor. Remember her? She was the one observing everything with a steely gaze. While Emperor Ai was on the throne, her direct power had waned, but her influence was still immense, like a deep river flowing silently beneath the surface. She and her family watched with growing alarm as Dong Xian accumulated power and wealth, viewing him as a direct threat to their long-term dominance. This was a mainstream historical fact. The struggle between the faction of the emperor's current favorites and the traditional power of the Empress Dowager's clan was a recurring theme in Han court politics. The resistance often took the form of carefully worded memorials, formal petitions or remonstrances presented to the emperor by upright Confucian scholars and ministers. These documents wouldn't directly attack Dong Xian or the emperor's personal choices. Instead, they would subtly lament the decline of ancient customs, the drain on the treasury, or the neglect of virtuous governance. They might quote ancient sages about the importance of impartiality and the dangers of allowing private affections to influence public affairs. It was a sophisticated game of innuendo and implied criticism, designed to prick the emperor's conscience or, failing that, to create public sentiment against Dong Xian. You might imagine a minister, head bowed respectfully, delivering a beautifully written scroll that, read between the lines, was a scathing indictment of the emperor's recent decisions. One particular, almost comical fringe tidbit involves an attempt by some disgruntled officials to subtly sabotage Dong Xian's public image by accidentally misplacing imperial decrees meant for him or confusing his orders with those of lesser officials. These small acts of bureaucratic obstruction were designed to cause minor inconveniences and embarrassments, chipping away at his authority. Historians still argue whether these were coordinated efforts by a large faction or simply individual acts of defiance by frustrated bureaucrats. Regardless, these petty annoyances contributed to the overall atmosphere of resistance that Dong Xian and Emperor Ai increasingly faced. Despite the emperor's unwavering support, the constant pressure began to take its toll. The court was divided, and governing became increasingly difficult as various factions maneuvered against each other. Emperor Ai found himself constantly defending Dong Xian, expelling or punishing ministers who dared to speak out too forcefully. This act of defending Dong Xian further isolated the emperor from his wider court, making him more dependent on his favorite and thus strengthening the opposition's narrative that Dong Xian was leading the emperor astray. The political landscape was becoming increasingly treacherous, a precarious tightrope walk for everyone involved.
As the years wore on, the grand drama of Emperor Ai and Dong Xian took a darker turn, shadowed by the emperor's declining health and the palpable increase in his already intense paranoia. You're now sensing a shift in the palace atmosphere, from lavish indulgence to a more anxious, almost desperate cling. Emperor Ai, still a relatively young man, began to suffer from a mysterious illness, its symptoms never fully detailed in historical texts, but debilitating nonetheless. This physical decline amplified his reliance on Dong Xian, making their bond even more exclusive and, ironically, more precarious. Imagine the emperor, once vibrant, now visibly weaker, perhaps prone to fits of coughing or periods of extreme fatigue. His already fragile grip on the vast machinery of the empire began to loosen. In such a state, the comfort and constant presence of Dong Xian became not just a preference, but a perceived necessity. Dong Xian was his confidant, his nurse, his everything.
This was a mainstream historical fact. The emperor's deteriorating health contributed significantly to his increased reliance on Dong Xian, further isolating him from the wider court and fueling the rumors that Dong Xian might be exerting an unhealthy influence over the ailing monarch. You might hear servants whispering about strange tonics being prepared, or hushed conversations about the emperor's increasing reclusiveness, always with Dong Xian at his side. This period also saw a marked increase in Emperor Ai's paranoia. Weakness often breeds suspicion, and the emperor, feeling his power ebb, became intensely fearful of plots and betrayals. He saw enemies everywhere, especially among the powerful clans and ministers who had openly or subtly opposed Dong Xian. Anyone who dared to criticize Dong Xian, even indirectly, faced severe repercussions, ranging from exile to execution. This created a chilling effect at court. Fewer and fewer dared to speak truth to power, leaving Dong Xian as virtually the sole voice in the emperor's ear. It's like watching a psychological thriller where the protagonist, increasingly isolated, trusts only one person, making that person incredibly powerful but also incredibly vulnerable. A particularly poignant and quirky tidbit from this time recounts how Emperor Ai would insist on Dong sleeping directly beside him, not just in the same bed, but often holding hands even through the night. This wasn't merely affection, it was almost a security blanket, a desperate need for constant physical reassurance as his world seemed to shrink. Historians still argue whether this profound dependency was solely a result of love, or if Dong Xian, perhaps unconsciously, capitalized on the emperor's physical and mental vulnerability to solidify his own position. Was Dong Xian truly comforting the emperor, or was he merely filling a vacuum created by illness and fear? The isolation grew. With the emperor increasingly unwell and suspicious, the day-to-day governance of the empire increasingly fell to Dong Xian and his family. Memorials from distant provinces piled up, court audiences became rarer, and important decisions were often made in the quiet intimacy of the emperor's bedchamber, with only Dong Xian present. This concentration of power, born of illness and paranoia, set the stage for the dramatic and swift downfall that was soon to come. The delicate balance of the court had been completely upended, creating an incredibly unstable political landscape. As Emperor Ai's health continued its inexorable decline, his thoughts turned with increasing urgency to the future, specifically to securing Dong Xian's position after his own death. You're now privy to the emperor's most desperate wishes, uttered from a bed of growing infirmity, wishes that would ignite a firestorm of controversy and ultimately prove futile. This was perhaps the emperor's final, most audacious attempt to defy the conventions of succession for the sake of his beloved. Imagine the hushed atmosphere in the imperial bedchamber, the air thick with the scent of medicinal herbs. Emperor Ai, weakened but resolute, gathered a few trusted officials, likely those already loyal to Dong Xian, and expressed his final, most controversial desire. He wished to abdicate the throne in favor of Dong Xian. Yes, you heard that right. He wanted to hand over the entire Han Empire, a dynasty stretching back centuries, to his young male concubine. This was not a rumor, it was a deeply unsettling mainstream historical fact, recorded by later historians with a mix of shock and condemnation. The idea was utterly, completely unprecedented. It was like suggesting today that a head of state should simply hand over power to their personal assistant. The few officials present, likely trembling, would have gently, respectfully tried to steer the emperor away from such a radical notion. They would have reminded him of ancestral laws, of the mandate of heaven, of the sacred trust placed in the imperial lineage. But Emperor Ai, by this point, was consumed by his devotion and perhaps a desperate fear for Dong Xian's fate once he was gone. He was clinging to the idea that his love could transcend even death and the immutable laws of succession. You can almost feel the sheer weight of historical precedent bearing down on that quiet room, clashing against the singular, fervent will of a dying emperor. A particularly poignant and quirky tidbit from this period describes the emperor, in his delirium or desperation, constantly murmuring about making the world as a gift to Dong Xian. This phrase encapsulates the almost childish, yet terrifyingly powerful extent of his infatuation. Historians still argue whether Dong Xian actively encouraged these thoughts, subtly manipulating the dying emperor, or if he was genuinely uncomfortable with such an impossible proposition, knowing the chaos it would unleash. Was he a calculating opportunist, or simply a young man caught in the terrifying vortex of imperial affection? Ultimately, the emperor's will to abdicate in Dong Xian's favor was never formalized, never publicly declared in a way that could legally bind the court. The senior officials, particularly the still powerful Empress Dowager Wang and her network, simply stalled, prevaricated, and perhaps even deliberately delayed processing such a contentious imperial decree. They understood that to allow such a transfer of power would plunge the empire into civil war and irrevocably shatter the very foundation of the Han Dynasty. They were waiting, patiently, for the inevitable. The emperor's dying wish, though never truly enacted, perfectly illustrates the dangerous precipice upon which Dong Xian's fortune rested, entirely dependent on the life force of one man. The inevitable arrived with chilling suddenness. On a warm summer day in 1 BC, Emperor Ai, still young, barely 25 years old, succumbed to his mysterious illness. You're standing by, perhaps a palace guard, witnessing the immediate aftermath, a moment of profound silence followed by a chaotic scramble for power. The very air in the palace seemed to hold its breath, then crackle with the energy of a lightning storm about to break. Dong Xian's world, built entirely on the emperor's singular devotion, instantly crumbled. The death of an emperor, even a beloved one, always created a power vacuum, a dangerous interregnum where the future of the empire hung in the balance. But this was different. Emperor Ai had no son, no clear, universally accepted heir from his own lineage. This lack of direct succession was a mainstream historical fact that dramatically complicated the transition of power, creating an opening for various factions to assert their claims. And into this vacuum stepped the formidable Empress Dowager Wang Shengzhen, who, as you'll recall, had been patiently biding her time. Immediately upon the emperor's demise, protocol dictated that the Empress Dowager assume temporary regency, acting as the ultimate authority until a new emperor could be enthroned. This was her moment. She quickly moved to assert control, her first and most critical act being to summon Dong Xian. Imagine that summons arriving, perhaps delivered by stern-faced eunuchs, the polite words masking an iron will. Dong Xian, who had been the most powerful man in the empire just hours before, was suddenly isolated, utterly vulnerable. The very source of his immense power, Emperor Ai, was gone. It was like watching a plant wither the moment it severed from its roots. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this moment suggests that Dong Xian, in his grief and shock, may have initially been too distraught to fully comprehend the immediate danger he was in. He was accustomed to deference, to having his every whim indulged, and perhaps couldn't grasp how swiftly the tides of power could turn. Historians still argue whether Dong Xian was genuinely naive to the political realities, or if his profound sorrow for Emperor Ai overshadowed any immediate concern for his own survival. Regardless, his hesitation, if it existed, was a fatal misstep. The Empress Dowager Wang didn't waste a second. Her first directive was to demand the return of the imperial seal, the symbol of ultimate authority, which Emperor Ai, in his final days, had reportedly entrusted to Dong Xian. This was a critical move. Without the imperial seal, no orders could be officially issued, no appointments made, no decrees legitimized. It effectively stripped Dong Xian of any remaining administrative power. The palace guards, who just yesterday had bowed before him, now stood impassively, their loyalty shifting back to the traditional seat of power. The vast wealth, the countless gifts, the loyal retainers, none of it mattered without the emperor's protective shadow. The stage was set for a dramatic fall, as swift and brutal as his rise had been glorious.
With the imperial seal reclaimed and the Empress Dowager Wang firmly in control, Dong Xian's fall from grace was not merely a descent, it was a precipitous, uncontrolled plunge. You're witnessing the swift, brutal dismantling of a man's entire world, a testament to how quickly power can vanish when its source expires. The palace, once a haven of affection for him, became a cage, then a tomb. The first immediate action against Dong Xian was swift and decisive. He was stripped of all his official titles and ranks. The Grand Marshal, the Marquis of Gaoan, even if only titularly at times, the immense wealth, all of it was formally revoked. This wasn't just a bureaucratic formality, it was a public humiliation, a clear declaration that his imperial favor was no more. Imagine the murmurs in the court, the sharp intakes of breath as each title was systematically peeled away. The officials who had once fawned over him now avoided his gaze, scrambling to distance themselves from the fallen favorite. His family too suffered the same fate. His father, Dong Gong, was dismissed from his high office. His brother, Dong Quan, stripped of his command of the Imperial Guard. All the members of the Dong clan who had been elevated by Emperor Ai's whim were unceremoniously expelled from their positions. Their vast properties and immense wealth, accumulated so rapidly, were confiscated and returned to the imperial treasury. This systemic purge was a mainstream historical fact, illustrating how a change in imperial power often meant a complete reversal of fortunes for the previous regime's favorites. It's like watching a modern political party lose an election and every single appointee and family member of the former administration gets instantly fired and investigated. Dong Xian himself was placed under house arrest, confined to his residence, effectively a prisoner. The opulent home that had once been filled with imperial gifts and lavish entertainments was now his gilded cage. The guards outside were no longer there for his protection, but for his containment. You can almost feel the chilling silence that would have descended upon that mansion, replacing the constant buzz of activity and deference. A particularly grim and quirky tidbit from the immediate aftermath involves the fate of the imperial messengers who had once rushed to fulfill Dong Xian's every request. Now, under the new regime, they were reportedly reprimanded or even punished for their past eagerness to serve him. It was a clear message to anyone who had benefited from Emperor Ai's favoritism: your past loyalties would now be your downfall. Historians still argue whether Dong Xian foresaw his impending doom, or if the speed and totality of his undoing left him in a state of stunned disbelief. Within days, perhaps even hours, of being stripped of his power, Dong Xian met his end. The official histories record that he committed suicide along with his wife to avoid further humiliation and punishment. Whether this was a truly voluntary act or a suggested course of action is, of course, debated. But the speed of his demise, just a few days after Emperor Ai's death, speaks volumes about the precariousness of his position. The man who had once commanded the emperor's love and the empire's resources was now gone, a stark example of the brutal realities of power in the Han court. Dong Xian's story, for all its brevity and dramatic flair, cast a long shadow over the later Han Dynasty and continues to fascinate historians and cultural commentators alike. You're now stepping back from the immediate events, allowing the dust to settle, to consider the enduring legacy of this most famous male concubine. His rise and fall became a cautionary tale, a mainstream historical fact cited repeatedly to illustrate the dangers of imperial access and unchecked favoritism. He was the poster child for what could go wrong when a ruler allowed personal affection to supersede the affairs of state. His name became synonymous with the cut-sleeve idiom, forever associating him with intense male intimacy, a quirky tidbit that has transcended centuries and continues to shape perceptions of same-sex relationships in Chinese culture. This linguistic legacy ensures that even if one doesn't know the full story of Emperor Ai and Dong Xian, the phrase itself carries the echo of their profound, if ultimately tragic, bond.
It's a whisper from the past, reminding us that emotional connections, no matter how unconventional, can leave an indelible mark on language and society. Historians still argue vehemently over the true nature of Dong Xian himself. Was he a cynical opportunist, coldly exploiting a lonely emperor's affections for personal gain and the elevation of his family? Or was he a genuinely devoted companion, perhaps a bit naive, thrust into an impossible position by the overwhelming love of a man who happened to be the son of heaven? There's no definitive answer, and the truth likely lies somewhere in the complex interplay of ambition, affection, and the unique pressures of the imperial court. You can almost hear the scholarly debates, their voices echoing through ancient libraries, each new generation of researchers reinterpreting the fragmented texts and reevaluating the motivations of these long-dead figures. Was Dong Xian a villain or a victim? The records offer glimpses, but no easy answers. Beyond the personal tragedy, Dong Xian's story is often seen as a symptom of the broader decline of the Western Han Dynasty. Emperor Ai's reign, with its focus on personal indulgence and the neglect of pressing administrative issues, contributed to the weakening of imperial authority and the growing power of ambitious clans like the Wangs. Dong Xian became a convenient scapegoat, embodying the perceived moral decay that led to the eventual usurpation of the throne by Wang Mang just a few years after Emperor Ai's death. His story thus serves as a microcosm of larger historical forces at play. The legacy of Dong Xian, therefore, is multifaceted. He is remembered as the epitome of imperial favor, a symbol of a love so profound it defied tradition. He is also a warning against the corrupting influence of absolute power and unchecked personal affection in governance. His life, brief and meteoric, reminds us of the precariousness of power, the ever-present currents of court intrigue, and the enduring human capacity for both profound devotion and ruthless ambition. The gentle hum of the past fades now, like the last embers of a campfire on a cool night. The echoes of courtly whispers and ancient dramas quieten, receding into the vast tapestry of history. You've walked the hallowed halls, felt the weight of imperial power, and witnessed a love story that defied an empire. Let the grandeur and the intrigue, the whispers of emperors and favorites, drift away like evening mist over tranquil waters. Your journey through the ancient world is complete for tonight. Rest now, letting the soft silence embrace you. May your dreams be filled with peace, far removed from the machinations of emperors and the rise and fall of fortunes.